Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, collector, bookseller. If you're new to the channel, welcome aboard. And I'm filming this early on a Sunday morning. I'm tired, as you can probably tell. I was hard at work bookselling yesterday, going like mad. And I just really wanted to share some news with you because it's something which has been preying on my mind, and it's really talking about numbers today, to talk about the best-selling science fiction and fantasy authors in the UK over the last year. And in my hand here, I am reading books, of course, but I have a magazine. This magazine is The Bookseller, which comes out every week. You can buy it in places like Smith's, but generally speaking, the subscriptions tend to be just people working in the book trade. And I've read this pretty much every week since, let me see, early 1984, when I started working in the book trade. And I had a period for a year where I was a freelance writer and doing some book selling. I missed some issues then. And I've always used it to keep up with what's happening. It's increasingly more about publishing. But this issue, which is dated 13th of January, reviews what's been happening with book sales in the UK over the last year. And there's a feature about science fiction and fantasy. So I'm going to show that to you now. And what it says: science fiction and fantasy flying high. Okay, so there we go. So what I thought I'd do, I'm actually just going to read you some of the figures and tell you a bit about it, what it says. Now, there's a thing called Bookscan, which is run by a firm called Nielsen Book Data. Nielsen Book Data are the firm who do what used to be called British Books in Print, the bibliographic resource that most booksellers use. Once upon a time, there was a firm called Whitaker's who did British Books in Print, and they used to do it when I started on a microfiche, which is like a bit of microfilm. It then later became a CD-ROM, and then eventually an online resource. And Whitaker's and Nielsen merged quite some time ago now, 20 years ago, and unfortunately I've never liked Nielsen's bibliographic work. I don't think it's as good as Whitaker's was. When they merged, sadly, it seemed to me as if the Whitaker's people, that standard went, the Nielsen standard was not so good. But Nielsen started a thing about 25 years ago called Bookscan, which reveals in some detail what the actual sort of best-selling books in the UK actually are. And it's not 100% because there's no way of doing 100%, but it's pretty close. So it's really interesting. So basically, this is what the Bookseller magazine says about SF and fantasy in the last 12 months. So I'm actually going to read it from you because this is a channel about reading, so you know, and maybe there'll be flashy graphics, but maybe not. So anyway, it says the last year was the best ever 12 months for science fiction and fantasy since records began. Let's say records began in this sense towards the end of the 20th century. So basically, they've been led by adaptations, mostly film and TV adaptations, that is, TikTok, which you'll have heard about, and a sprinkling of sort of literary prizes. So in the SFF category on Nielsen Bookscan, science fiction and fantasy, it churned out £46.8 million worth of sales. £46.8 million worth of sales, and that's UK only. Now, I've memorized these figures, as memorizing figures is boring. It's not the same as memorizing words and books and what have you. So the best 3 years before that were 2001 to 2003, when Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films were coming out, and obviously that caused a huge boom in Tolkien backlist sales, which are always there, and also of course in sort of fantasy generally, that helped generally. So in the last year, there was a boost to the Tolkien sales from Rings of Power on Amazon. The less said about that, the better, I think most of us feel. Obviously, there was George R. R. Martin, the prequel to Game of Thrones as well. And there's been some other things too. In terms of sort of newcomers, and by newcomers, what Nielsen means are people who suddenly sort of become really big sellers, they cite Holly Black and Olivia Blake as newcomers, racking up a lot of sales share. And basically, The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake was the third best-selling SFF title of 2022, and The Book of Night by Holly Black was the seventh. Book Talk has had a huge sort of impact again on Sarah J. Maas. Obviously, has been writing and publishing since about 2010. The article points out that she and Bloomsbury, her publisher, Bloomsbury, my publisher as well, have put in the work. So I haven't put in the work in the last 10 years, it has to be said. And you know, she's had books out since then. I once was on a bookstall at a lit fest where she was, and I was sort of struck. She wasn't like the typical fantasy author of the time. She was young, American lady. And there's always been female fantasy writers from the dawn of it. You go back to C.L. Moore and the Jirel of Jawiri series from the 1930s. C.L. Moore, one of my idols. But it wasn't what you expected. I'm more used to sort of dealing with people like Raymond Feist and Michael Moorcock and what have you, so it's quite a change. And they refreshed the covers in the last year, and they've done really well. And she had 6 out of the top 20 SFF bestsellers in the last year, were 6 of her books, which is, shows this backlist there as well. So that's a lot to do with Book Talk. There's a picture of her there, just there, and not what you think of, or not certainly what you used to think of when you think of a fantasy author. Things have changed, as this reveals. R.F. Kuang is cited a lot, and she's been doing really well as well. And the point that the article makes at the end, it says that this has been happening for some time, but it is interesting how much the F dominates SFF. 9 of the top 10 titles are from fantasy novelists, including Stephen King, who broadly speaking is a fantasy writer. He does some fantasy things now and again. Of course, it's horror, crime, what have you. Broadly, he's a fantastic writer. And Frank Herbert, comes into it because of the Villeneuve sort of Dune adaptation and people buying that. And if you look through what else it says, then once you get outside the sort of top 10, the next 5 SFF authors were Brandon Sanderson, Ben Aranovich, V.E. Schwab, Stephanie Garber, and Robert Jordan. They're all fantasy authors. In the top 25 titles for SFF in the UK, in the last year, in 2022, there's only one SF novel, and that's Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. And Andy Weir, it's not exactly the gold standard of literary SF. It's not exactly pushing the boundaries the way that good SF does. Sorry, Andy, but that's the way I feel about it. I'm going to read out to you the best-selling authors in SF and fantasy, the top 10, and I'm going to tell you what the sales came to in the UK. Well, at number 1 is Tolkien, of course. And his TCM value, that's the total consumer market, so that's as close as we can get to all the books sold in a year, that came to, let's see, £4,475,000. I could go a bit further. It's actually £4,475,600, but I'm going to drop the hundreds because they're kind of irrelevant, really. So Tolkien was number 1, no surprise there. Number 2 was Sarah J. Maas with sales of £3,698,000. Number 3 was George R. R. Martin with £1,681,000. Terry Pratchett, who of course is dead and has been for some time, £1,513,000. Holly Black, who I mentioned earlier, £1,393,000. Stephen King, £1,308,000. Frank Herbert, £1,220,000, because Herbert's been dead for decades. Sapkowski, The Witcher, you know that from the TV series and probably from the books as well, £1,213,000. R.F. Kuang, who I mentioned, and there she is there, she's just there. R.F. Kuang, £1,204,000, and Olivia Blake with, I always call her Olivia Blake, and I'm sure that's right, or maybe it's a misprint here. And I can't be honest, I'm not paying a lot of attention because they just stick them out and they just shift. I'm more interested in pushing the authors whose work, is underappreciated. These people sell themselves through Book Talk and the media. And Olivia Blake, £1,139,000. So there you go. So there's only one genre SF writer in there, and that's Frank Herbert, and he's dead. George R. R. Martin's written SF, but his SF isn't a big seller. People still don't read his backlist from prior to Game of Thrones very much at all. So there you go. So this is what I've seen in work for years, increasingly, and as long as I've been a bookseller, since 1984, and this really started in 1977, and you can watch my video, The Artificial Fantasy Trilogy, since 1977. We've seen the shifting of publishing money going from SF to fantasy. Now, if you go back to the end of the 70s and early 80s and you had a bookshop, if you had every single science fiction and fantasy title in print in the UK, you would have several bays. A bay is like, or a drop, as some people say, of shelves. You have 7 or 8 shelves, and then you have another section and what have you. So you get these dividings, and they're usually about 1 metre wide. So if you had a copy of every fantasy novel published back then, you'd maybe fill one bay if you were lucky. And you couldn't do that in the 70s. It wasn't until the 80s where you could just about do it. And that was sort of mid-80s, and then it expanded even more. and SF is a lot more dominant. It's the other way round now. And what we're seeing here is, I think there's a real problem here, because to me, science fiction and fantasy are distinct. It does take an expert sometimes to tell the difference between the two, but they are distinct. They've been linked in the past for historical reasons, because back in the days of the pulp magazines, from the turn of the century right the way up until the 60s and early 70s, generally speaking, you did get people who wrote SF and fantasy: Poul Anderson, Michael Moorcock, Jack Vance. We could go on and on and on. But the fact is that since 1977, there's been more of a dividing line. There are fantasy authors who don't write SF and vice versa. And the difference in the market, because the philosophy behind these things is different. Fantasy is fundamentally, in its popular forms, about escapism, whereas SF is not. SF is about confronting the future and paradigm shift, conceptual breakthrough. And if you want to know more about that, watch my series, The Elements of SF, which includes a video about the difference between science fiction and fantasy. To me, they're distinct markets. They've been growing a lot more distinct as time has gone on. The crossover's been far less, and fantasy's grown more popular. And I basically think that because fantasy, I think, is more accessible than science fiction. Science fiction demands the audience work harder. Not always, not in the case of like Andy Weir or, you know, The Expanse or whatever. But if you talk about the singleton science fiction novels, what some people call standalones, I don't use that term myself, you know, you've got to sort of invest in the world and you have to get used to it, and there's all the sort of shocks and cognitive dissonance and what's. With fantasy, it uses familiar tropes and symbols all the time, so it is one of those things. So what's happened, it's not that people have been abandoning SF for fantasy. What's been happening over that time is that a new audience has grown up, a point where people just had Tolkien, and then came the imitators and what have you. And basically what I've seen in my job increasingly is that whenever I go into our SF and fantasy section, the predominant market, if I look at the demographic, and this is purely a demographic observation, is there is now a massive market for fantasy, which is being read predominantly by young women, and it's predominantly written by young women. Now, I've no problem with this at all. It's not an issue to me. What is an issue to me is the fact that because fantasy and science fiction are linked historically in the minds of publishers, the budget that any publisher, even somebody like Golax, who has a long-term commitment to SF going back to 1962, they'll have a sort of budget to spend on what they publish. And increasingly, the money has gone to fantasy. Now, of course, publishers are in the business to make money. If they make money out of those things, that's fair enough. But the issue is that the markets which exist for science fiction are not so well served, and they're just sort of leeching away. Now, something that I've seen on YouTube is a lot of sort of people who, I guess, I don't really say them my peers, because I think a lot of people doing YouTube and SF, you know, they don't come from a professional background like myself. They're just, you know, they're just fans, and that's absolutely fine. But from a professional background, what I would say is this: we have this thing where, if you look at the videos out there, science fiction for beginners, and I've been thinking of making one, but everybody does one, but you know, I don't really want to do one in a way, because I think it's really, really hard as a professional bookseller who's always asked, what can I read? It's really hard, because you really do need a knowledge of what somebody's read, what their reading level is like. And this is a lot more sort of diverse now, and I mean that in a way that people, especially under a certain age, you've grown up with a heck of a lot of screens, and there's a lot more distraction. It's hard to work out what people's attention spans are, so it's very, very difficult. So I don't think there are any ideal books for beginners. There's ideal books for one person, will not be ideal books for another, and this is the problem. And I think the more that the publishing money goes to fantasy, which tends to use familiar symbols, as I say, and less away from SF, which really thrives when it works with the unfamiliar, you know, then it's going to be an increasing problem to get good quality SF out there. So I would say to anybody who loves science fiction to get into the bookshops and buy it. Don't buy it online. You can buy it online, of course, and that's good for the authors. But the fact is, if you don't go into bookshops and you don't buy SF off the shelves, then the buyers have to think very carefully about the budget they have to spend and what money they need to put into there. And they will spend it on fantasy because it's there in piles. So if you want to see a good range of SF, both new and backlist, in the bookshops, you have to get out and buy it from bookshops. Otherwise, you know, it's just going to dwindle away. And when you look at it, if I think of Britain's top sort of SF novelists in terms of literary quality, Christopher Priest, M. John Harrison, Adam Roberts, Chris Beckett, these sort of people. And, you know, the space opera writers like Peter F. Hamilton and Alastair Reynolds, their books are not selling as well as they were in bookshops. That's an absolute fact. And, you know, so if you love SF, you have to get into bookshops and buy it from bookshops. Otherwise, you know, you will go into your SFF section, you'll find that it's nothing but fantasy. Now, in an ideal world, I would separate the two things out, and I used to do that in the 80s. I kept science fiction and fantasy separately. I'm not working so much with them in the trade now as I was. And also, it does take a certain level of expertise which most people don't have, which most booksellers don't have, quite frankly, because you have to be familiar with the text and have a clear idea what the difference between the two things is, or how they're marketed. So it's quite a concern. Something that is interesting in here is that when you look at, there's a little breakdown by award winners, what awards have done. And interestingly, the #1 sort of best-selling book in the UK in fiction literary awards, if I can find it here, is actually an SF novel. And there's the author there, Kazuo Ishiguro. And Literary Prize boosted authors top 10. #1, Kazuo Ishiguro, won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, and the sales of his book Clara and the Sun, which is about AI robots, 1,921,000. So there you go. So, but of course, that's not marketed as a science fiction novel. It's marketed as a mainstream novel. Now, I like Ishiguro's writing. I haven't read this one. I'm rather concerned because I think somebody like him, you know, is getting these sales. So really, people should probably be reading Holy Machine by Chris Beckett, or, you know, Durando's Dream of Electric Sheep, or one of the many, many great books about AI which have been in genre SF since the 1920s. And if it was in print, I'd be telling you to go out and buy The Soul of a Robot by Barrington Bailey, aka The Soul of the Robot, Barrington J. Bailey. So if you see it, pick it up. He's dead, sadly. A great book like Candide by Voltaire. So there's a little insight into what's been selling. That's my concerns, that we're going to see more and more money going to fantasy. Well, the two things are linked. So publishers, think about splitting your budgets. Think about the audience that wants SF. I get people coming to me and they say, you know, what's good? And I'm saying to them, you know, there's nothing new under the sun, unfortunately. We're in a real situation. And SF's been in decline in terms of its development for 30 years, in my opinion. And I've talked about that before on the channel. I'll talk about it again. But that's an insight into the sales. So if you want to see SF expanding, you know, and getting new converts, and if you want to keep up, you must go into bookshops and buy from bookshops, please. If you're a fantasy reader, you're probably doing okay. But you will notice that, as I say, it's a new market emerging. It's driven by TikTok, and it's mostly a young female market. If you look at Sarah J. Maas, her early books are YA books. So it's an audience which is growing up, coming out of YA and into adult fantasy, and usually is the content is a bit more adult in terms of sexuality or what have you. So, and often it's just lightweight romance in the clothing of fantasy. With magic, you can explain anything. So I'm not really very engaged with it. If you are, that's absolutely fine. Anyway, I hope you found those figures interesting. This is Outlaw Bookseller. Please subscribe, like, comment, super thanks if you desire, and all that. And I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.